The other day, I was walking across town, and a bicyclist zoomed by and almost ran me over. Has that ever happened to you? I was in the crosswalk, and the light was in my favor, and I noticed coming up the avenue in my peripheral vision, I noticed a bicyclist zooming down the avenue. And so I turned to him and tried to make eye contact with him to let him know, hello, I'm in the crosswalk, and I'm crossing with the light. So I kept looking, and eventually I did make eye contact with him, and he saw me, and I felt good, and I breathed a sigh of relief, and I kept on walking. And then without any warning, he zoomed right past me, within inches of me, almost knocking me over. And I thought, what happened? He clearly saw me, and he knew that the light was in my favor, and he decided to put both of our lives in danger? What's going on? Immediately, I turned around to see if anybody else had witnessed what I had gone through. I turned to my right, but the only person in the crosswalk with me was a woman, and she was on her cell phone, so she had no idea what had just happened. So as I continued walking across town, every time I saw a bicyclist, I tried to give them a mean stare. I say try to because I'm not sure how effective my mean stare actually was. And every time I came to a crosswalk and I would be waiting for the light to change with other pedestrians, I would try to give them a look of warning, saying, watch out, there are bicyclists out there and they're after us. And in hindsight, I'm not sure how different my warning stare was from my mean stare. In my desire to be known and understood and heard, how quickly I associated myself with other people. I connected myself with the other pedestrians there. I created a community of people who didn't know me and I didn't know them, but yet I created an us pedestrians. And how quickly in my desire to maintain the sanctity of the us did I create a them, the bicyclists, the other who were out to get us. In our society today, many of our situations are oversimplified and framed in the context of a conflict between us and them, between the pedestrians and the bicyclists, between the Mets and the Yankees, between the Jets and the Giants. Another acceptable answer would be the Sharks. We are at Middle Church, after all. And we need to balance our sports references with our musical theater references, the Jets versus the Sharks. And then as we expand the globalness of the us versus them, we see how much higher the stakes become, as we see the us versus them being Ukraine versus Russia, Israel versus Palestine, all of the various factions in Iraq with each other. And closer to home in our nation, what has been capturing our attention this week, blacks versus whites in Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri, where an 18-year-old unarmed African-American young man, Michael Brown, was shot and killed by a white police officer, Darren Wilson. And the nation is grieving the loss of Michael Brown. As Camille mentioned, there were vigils around our nation grieving the loss of not only Michael Brown, but all those who lost their lives due to police violence and police misconduct. Camille and I gathered in Union Square, and eventually our vigil turned into an impromptu march, and we marched up Fifth Avenue and Broadway, and as Camille mentioned, we held our hands up and shouted, "Hands up, don't shoot. Hands up, don't shoot." And our voices echoed in the cavern of buildings that lined Broadway. It was when I got to about a little bit before Times Square that I felt a hand on my shoulder, and it was Camille. And I was pleasantly surprised to see her. I was surprised to hear that she grew up in Ferguson, Missouri. and I was deeply moved by her words that Ferguson is every town. Every town is Ferguson. There are still many questions related to the death of Michael Brown. But one thing is clear. One thing is clear. That the shooting of Michael Brown was unnecessary. That the killing of Michael Brown was unjust. That the death of Michael Brown highlights for everyone in our nation the deep problems of race in our country. Quite frankly, I am scared. I'm frightened. I'm frightened to think that an 18-year-old African-American man can be shot and killed in the middle of the day simply for walking down the center of the street. That frightens me. I'm frightened by the fact that a white police officer who had a gun, who was in a car, who had access to a police radio, felt so threatened by Mike Brown, felt so endangered by Mike Brown that he had to leave his car and shoot him. I am hurt that African Americans are so angry about the state of racial injustices in our country that some of them have decided to destroy property in Ferguson. And I am scared that the predominantly white local authorities in Ferguson decided to respond. They were so out of touch with the communities that they are being paid to serve that they thought it was an appropriate response to send military tanks and tear gas. I'm scared. I'm scared for all the ways in which our us versus theming dehumanizes everyone involved. We no longer see each other as human beings. We see each other as types, as us versus them. I'm scared by the ways in which our us versus theming is putting all of our lives in danger. Paul, too, when he wrote his letter to the Romans, was also very scared for the state of the Roman Empire, specifically around anti-Jewish sentiment that was bubbling up across the empire at the time. This is the mid-first century. And Paul is very aware that among the Roman aristocracy, there are anti-Jewish sentiments bubbling up. And even within early Christian communities, there are anti-Jewish sentiments bubbling up. And a few years before that, there were riots in Alexandria, Egypt, where Jews were systematically persecuted and killed. And just a few years before Paul writes this letter to the Romans, there were tax riots directed against Jews in a town not too far from Rome. Rome, which, as you remember, was the capital of the empire. It was where all things happened related to economics, military, and politics. Paul knows his audience of human beings. He knows human nature, and so he's very clever. He phrases his argument in terms of us versus them. And the us, in this case, are the Gentile Christians, the Roman Christians who didn't grow up with the Jewish faith, tradition, culture. The them are the Israelites, the Jewish people, who had not yet fully embraced the teachings of Jesus Christ. And so Paul frames his argument in terms of us versus them. And the primary question that Paul is trying to answer in his letter to the Romans is this: how is it that if the Hebrew people, if the Israelites were God's chosen people, why is it that they're being disobedient to God now? Because in Paul's definition, they weren't following Christ and therefore they were being disobedient. And why is it that instead it's the Gentiles who are following in the teachings of Christ? How do we reconcile that? And so Paul's response to that is really quite clever. He says that God is working through the disobedience of the Jewish people, because when the apostles originally went out and they preached and taught and served bread and cup and shared bread and cup with communities. When they were spreading the good news of the gospel, they originally started with the Jewish communities. But they realized very quickly that their words were landing on deaf ears for many of them. And so the apostles were forced to go elsewhere and to preach to the Gentiles. And Paul says, if it weren't for the disobedience of the Jews, you would have never received the good news of the gospel. God is actually working through the disobedience of the Israelites so that God can expand what it means to be God's chosen people to include everyone, not only the Israelites, but the Gentiles as well, and everybody in God's household. So Paul's teachings can be summarized in 3 points. First, we are all disobedient to God. At some point in our journeys, we are all disobedient to God. The Gentiles didn't know God before the apostles came to them. And the Israelites have turned away from God because they haven't embraced the teachings of Jesus. We are all disobedient to God in some point along our journeys as communities. Point 2, that God responds to our disobedience with mercy. How's that for a shocker? God responds not with punishment, not with anger or spite, but with mercy, with love, with kindness. The fact that the Gentiles hadn't known the teachings of the Jewish tradition before the apostles came to them, God's not interested in punishing them for that. God wants to show them a way of love and mercy and kindness. So point 2 is that God responds to our disobedience with mercy. How beautiful is that? And the final point that Paul makes is that God is working through our disobedience, through our humanness, with all of our flaws, with all of our imperfections, but yes, also with all of our gifts and our talents, so that we can expand what it means to be a member of the household of God. We are all a part of the household of God, and God is working through us in all of our humanity to share God's love with the world. And that's it. So we've reflected on last week in Ferguson, Missouri. We've reflected on first century Rome. So what do we do today here in New York, or if you're worshiping with us online, wherever you are, what do we do here today? How do we allow God to work through us with all of our humanness so that we can share God's love with all of God's creation? In your bulletin today, we've listed 3 action items. You can pull it out now if you want to. It'll be under the title, Faithful Disobedience. The first thing that we are asking you to do is to sign a petition. This petition is on change.org, and it is a petition to President Barack Obama, Representative John Boehner, and Senator Harry Reid to enact new federal laws to protect citizens from police violence and corruption. You'll find a link to that petition on our website. The second thing that we're asking you to do is the photo that we took during the long prayer this morning, share that with your social networks. Now, as I say this, I'm mindful that not everyone at Middle is on board with this. We have some people who are not really into the Middle sharing themselves with the outside world. But let me tell you this, social media is the way that our world communicates with each other. Social media is now the way in which change is happening in our world, not only in our nation, but in our world. Have you seen it? It's remarkable. So even if you have hesitations with technology, and I'll admit right now, I'm one of those people. It took me 2 years to figure out what the timeline on Facebook was. I'm not kidding, 2 years. But I'm going to share that photo because that is how change happens. And here at Middle Church, why won't we? Why wouldn't we use all the tools and resources available to us? Some people in our congregation are concerned, well, the media is here and we're on broadcast, and Middle's trying to get famous. Middle's trying to promote its brand image. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're not doing this to be famous. Take a look around at this sanctuary. Take a look around right now. Have you ever experienced church like this? What God is doing here in this space is unique, and we need to share that with the world. We're not doing this for fame. We're doing this because we want to expand God's household to include everyone. Everyone is welcome in God's household. And when we share this photo, we will share that message with the world. And finally, the third action item is to pray. We're calling you to pray for racial healing and reconciliation in our world. Pray for the family of Michael Brown and for all those who lost their lives due to police brutality. Pray for the police of Ferguson, Missouri, especially for Darren Wilson and his family. And pray for yourself. Pray that God will continue to work through you with all your flaws, with all your disobediences, with all of your gifts and talents. Pray that God will work through you to help share God's love and expand God's love with the world. Pray for me that I stop theming the bicyclists. And I'll be praying for you too. May it be so.